So it's wonderful to see all of you. I hope you and your families are well. I'm sending love and positive energy and best wishes. So I hope things are well. A couple of announcements, and then we will have, as I was jokingly referring to a few minutes ago, hopefully a kind of light, limited agenda. So the first announcement is, again, I don't need to remind you, the midterm is due today by midnight. So please email me at my CSUN email address, the midterm by midnight tonight. That's the first announcement. And I will get to them probably sometime next week. I ask that you be a little bit patient. There's the tragedy class, their midterms came in on Tuesday, and then I will get to yours. So please, I just ask in advance a little bit. I'm very excited to read them. I'm looking forward to reading them. This is one of the best groups of students and thinkers and intellectuals and souls I've had in 20 years of teaching. So I'm actually very excited to see your midterms. That's the first thing, midterms due tonight by midnight. Another announcement, probably the second or next two announcements. We are now leaving Mill and Nietzsche, and we are going to turn to a book by Richard Rorty, this book. And the book is titled Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity. And this is the book we will be working with up until the final exam. So you should have this book, and I'm going to start introducing it today in a very general way. But this is where we are going. We're transitioning from Mill to Nietzsche, now to Rorty. And we will be reading this book to the final. This is the book that will take us to the final. Now, as far as reading goes, the only formal reading assignment is the introduction to Rorty's Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity. Just the introduction, and it's only 4 pages long. So yeah, it's 4 pages long. So please just read the introduction and don't go any further. Just read the introduction, kind of make your way through it, and we will have an entire lecture, a discussion on the introduction on next Tuesday. Okay, so just the introduction, 4 pages, Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity. And can you please remind me, did I send you the outline for the introduction and the lecture notes? No, I just sent you the transitionary notes, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so in the next couple days, be on the lookout for the outline, an extended outline on the introduction, as well as my lecture notes to the introduction. I will send those to you tomorrow over the weekend, so you have them when we get into Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity officially on Tuesday. All right? So we know where we are. Midterms due tonight. Read the intro to Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity. It's 4 pages. And I will send you the outline, the lecture notes for it over the weekend. And then we will just make our way through Rorty as we move towards the final. Everything good?
Sounds good.
Good, beautiful. All right, so what do I want to do today? I haven't asked you to read any Rorty yet, so obviously you're not prepared. I wouldn't ask you to be prepared. I wouldn't begin a lecture on things I haven't asked you to read or I haven't introduced. And so what do I want to do today? How do I want to sort of segue or transition between Mill and Nietzsche and Rorty and the extraordinarily beautiful project that Rorty has set up in Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity? And so what I want to do is I want to take this time and I want to reframe the class, or I want to remind all of us of the frame of the class. What's the project of the class? What's the frame? What's the project? What's the bigger theme, what's the bigger project that's unfolding if we look at the class as a whole class. And I want to do that one because I want to remind us where we've been, and I want to use that as a way of transitioning into and introducing Rorty and Rorty's project. So that's what I want to do today. And again, I think this is very helpful because the course has a frame, it has a structure, it has a kind of agenda. And I want to sort of rehearse that agenda and use that as a way of transitioning into Rorty. So here's the frame, here's the story. Let's just do some storytelling about political science 414. So this course, as you know, is titled Contemporary Political Theory. And it spans the time, historical and philosophical time, from basically the early 1800s to our present time. Now, admittedly, that framing of that timing is subjective, right? Contemporary, does it begin in 1801? Does it begin in 1850 and go to the current time? We don't know. It's subjective. So this course is called Contemporary Political Theory. And at least from my subjective point of view, or the way of framing and structuring this class, I decided to identify the origins, the loose origins of contemporary. What does contemporary mean? Beginning around the 1800s to our present time. So for our purposes here, for my subjective imposition of this frame of time, of historical time and space, contemporary refers from the early 1800s, literally to right now. Rorty, we recently passed away, but he's a contemporary writer. He's alive during our time. So this course is called Contemporary Political Theory, and it spans the time frame from the early 1800s to our present time. Now, as you can imagine, even just the last 200 years, 210, 220 years of political philosophy, contemporary political philosophy, includes an extraordinary amount of philosophical ideas. It includes some of the most profound thinkers in modern and contemporary political philosophy. And so it spans a great diversity of ideas, and it includes an extraordinary number of extremely profound and brilliant thinkers. And in fact, modern, late modern, contemporary political theory, the ideas emerging, the minds active is vast, and it's too much to do in a survey course. It just wouldn't make any sense to do a week on Marx, and a week on Hegel, and a week on Nietzsche, and then a week on Strauss, and then a week on Derrida, a week on Foucault, or a week on Mill. It's too much to do in a survey course like that. So what have I done when I think about this course? So in order to try to structure and frame this course in some way, I try to engage the term contemporary political theory by identifying one of the many, extremely important philosophical ideas of modernity and contemporary political theory. And as you know, because we've been in the class, that term is freedom. One of the most important philosophical concepts of modernity and the way modernity emerges into contemporary political theory is the philosophical idea of freedom and the modern and the contemporary human obsession with it. So we've been talking about freedom. So one of the ways we got into this class was to identify an important theme of contemporary political theory. Now, in addition to identifying an extraordinarily important theme in contemporary political theory, I thought that I would structure the class not according just to a theme, but to engage that theme, in this case, freedom, from one of the most important and profound debates within contemporary political theory. And that is the great debate between modernity and postmodernity. So as we think so far about how PS, political science 414, contemporary political theory, has been structured for our purposes. We have identified an important theme in contemporary political theory, that is freedom. And so far, we've investigated that theme from the point of view of one of the most important and profound debates within contemporary political theory, and that's the great debate between modernity and postmodernity. And so far, we've seen that debate between Mill and Nietzsche. Now, in order to move the course forward, I have chosen 3 writers to investigate freedom and to investigate the modern and postmodern debate. And we have chosen Mill, we have chosen Nietzsche, and now we are going to explore Richard Rorty's Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity. Now, as you know, because this was part of your midterm and we've been talking about this, any discussion of the idea of freedom has immediately forced us to engage the question of human agency, because it's necessary to understand what Mill thinks about human agency in order to understand how he conceives of freedom and the practices in freedom, and equally as important, what the purposes of freedom are and the relationships between freedom and politics. So any discussion of freedom requires we investigate the meaning of human agency. And of course, since this is a political theory course, we are going to investigate the relationship, the meaning and the relationship of human agency, freedom, and politics. So, where have we been and where are we going? So I want to tell you the story. Mill's project, the goal of Mill's project is to identify a certain account of freedom, what we have been calling an aristocratic liberalism. And the purpose of Mill's project is to identify a certain account of freedom in order to enable us to discover and cultivate our moral agency, what Mill had called our true self. To set in motion the process, Mill had said, of getting other people's voices out of our heads. And not only to activate and cultivate practices of freedom, to discover our own moral agency, but in addition, in the political dimension of life, to learn how to participate as robust, well-informed citizens in an open, dynamic, social, and political space. For Mill, this project is essential to enable us to free ourselves from the voices of others in our minds. And it is essential as the only meaningful defense against the emergence of social and political tyranny. Individuals and political communities, Mill argues, that are unable to activate these practices of freedom have no history, as Mill said in a very profound way. Now, Nietzsche's goal in the genealogy of morals is to identify the real or more comprehensive historical origins of the ideas of good and bad and the meaning of the original distinction between them. Moreover, Nietzsche then traces the way the original meaning of and distinction between good and bad becomes transvalued, becomes transformed, becomes changed into the new meanings, good and evil, and the distinction between them. Nietzsche argues that Mill's account of moral agency and enlightened democratic politics and the type of freedom necessary to attain them does not help us discover our moral agency and liberate us, but rather produces modes of what Nietzsche calls the slave morality that make us obedient to moral fictions of the true and elevated self, and make us obedient to egalitarian norms of democracy. And Nietzsche had famously said in another essay, we in fact are the last people. The result of this historical process has been catastrophic to the human spirit. And in fact, we are not only unknown to ourselves, Nietzsche had said, but we are in fact the last people. So as we saw for Nietzsche in the genealogy of morals, what is at stake in identifying certain practices of freedom and in activating certain practices of freedom? What is at stake in this great existential project is the question of the value of our highest values. What is Nietzsche called us to ask, to investigate, to raise the question for ourselves? What is the value of our highest values? What's the value of our moral truths? And the question, and the equally as important, if not more penetrating question, not just what is the value of our highest value, is the question of whether our highest values are in fact doing what they're supposed to do. Are our highest values expanding our consciousness, liberating us, empowering us emotionally and intellectually? Or, as we saw in the genealogy of morals, has our belief in and commitment to the truth and the practices of our highest values actually produced a kind of virtue out of weakness, a virtue out of meekness? Have our belief in and our commitment to our highest values made us free and emotionally strong, intellectually creative, or have they produced in us a slave morality? As we have been talking about postmodernism, as we frame this, what are the consequences to our minds and our bodies and our politics that result from our belief in and our commitment to our moral truth? For Nietzsche, freedom entails first the recognition that all moral truths are human inventions, and second, that these moral truths produce the slave morality. And third, that freedom entails the existential responsibility of one, becoming aware of this, and two, beginning the process of disentangling ourselves from this oppression, and then finding the emotional strength and intellectual creativity to give our lives and the world around us our own meaning, value, and purpose, and to find the strength throughout a long life of challenges and sufferings to do this over and over and over again. Therefore, Nietzsche advocates what is called a postmodern or an aesthetic theory of the self, which means that meaning, value, and ultimately practices of freedom are seen as acts of artistic or aesthetic creation. Life is for Nietzsche an aesthetic, not ascetic, but aesthetic project. Life is for Nietzsche a kind of a work of art, a creative aesthetic work of art. That freedom and the cultivation of meaning, value, and purpose are acts of self-creation, artistic acts of self-creation. Now, as we also saw in the genealogy of morals, as potentially empowering and seductive as that is, we also saw, as we worked our way through Nietzsche and Nietzsche's kind of knightly aristocratic view of the world, the way the slave morality produces a kind of virtue out of weakness, we also saw in Nietzsche an extraordinary disdain, if you will, a kind of and disdain's a good word, a kind of criticism, a kind of disdain, not only for the slave morality, but also for the politics that are simultaneous or part and parcel in our time with the slave morality. And part of this disdain, this kind of suspicion and this disdain for Nietzsche was focused on precisely what we would call modern liberal egalitarian democracy. So in the same way that Nietzsche was extraordinarily suspicious about the slave morality, critical of the slave morality, and critical for the reasons he identified, that suspicion, that disdain, those tools of criticism are also applicable from Nietzsche's point of view to modern liberal democratic society. Nietzsche, as you can imagine, would not have been an advocate. He would not have been a supporter of what we would in many ways call, literally, modern liberal social welfare egalitarian democracy. He would not have been an advocate of the sort of the social and political institutions and processes we've established. In fact, he would find liberal democracy as the political equivalent of the slave morality. So Nietzsche, despite this extraordinary investigation of metaphysics and this opening of an awareness of the possibility that our belief in and commitment to our highest values has not served us well, in fact, served us badly, and produced a politics of mediocrity and a kind of an insipid consumerism, right? While Nietzsche's critique was in some ways empowering, it is also very hostile at the last sense to our politics. And so as we leave Mill and Nietzsche, as we move through this modern, postmodern debate, we raise the question, we consider the possibility of a kind of project in which we conceive the potentiality for a kind of liberal democracy with a postmodern perspective, right? Is it possible to bring the best of Mill with the best of Nietzsche? And this brings us to Rorty. In this bold and creative work, Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity, at least as I want to read it, as we frame it in this class, I want to argue that Rorty will try to create what we could call a postmodern liberal democracy by radicalizing the negative freedom of Mill and making Nietzsche's aristocrat amenable to liberal democracy. So as we move through Mill, as we move through Nietzsche, as we move through this modern, postmodern debate, as we see the promises, as we see the critiques and potentially become aware of certain implications of metaphysics, as we move this and we move forward and we try to think beyond, as we try to think beyond Mill, as we try to think beyond Nietzsche, is there a way of imagining, of creating, of inventing something like a postmodern democracy? And what would that look like? Is it possible to radicalize, to push to its logical conclusions the negative freedom of Mill, and to somehow make Nietzsche's aristocrat amenable to democratic politics? Can we make Mill sufficiently postmodern? And can we make Nietzsche democratic? Is that possible? And if it is, how will we do this? First, and I think that this is something that Rorty's trying to do. This is what we're going to see in the first 4 chapters of contingency, irony, and solidarity. Rorty is going to radicalize Mill, politicize Nietzsche. And how is he going to do that? What does that project look like? First, Rorty is a postmodernist, period. Rorty is fully committed to a nominalist account of language. He's fully committed loosely to the kind of intellectual project we're calling postmodernism. So for Rorty, following Nietzsche, for Rorty, there is no common metaphysical essence to human beings. And you will see this argument in the preface. You'll see this argument in the first 3 chapters. Rorty is a thoroughgoing nominalist. He's a thoroughgoing postmodernist. He agrees with Nietzsche. He agrees with Nietzsche's suspicion that there are no metaphysical common essences to human nature or to the cosmos. There is no common metaphysical essence to human beings. In addition, for Rorty, as I just said, language, and this is going to become a critical idea in contingency, irony, and solidarity. And for Rorty, language is a human invention. And he will take that image, that kind of vision of it, that metaphor of language as a human invention, and he'll play with it poetically and creatively, and even take it to its logical conclusions. And he will say, look, not only is language a human invention, but like all inventions, they are tools. Language is a human invention, and it is a tool. It is a tool, a conceptual tool invented by human beings that enables them to do certain things. And he's going to play with this analogy in the same way that human beings invent tools, literally what we would call tools, hammers and saws and screwdrivers and planes and all sorts of tools. In the same way that we create all sorts of tools, physical and material tools, to enable us to build things, to construct things, to do things that don't exist in nature, to create and invent things that don't exist in nature. In the same way we construct of and conceive material tools, in that way, we need to think of words as tools. And we must start to think of words as tools that have specific purposes, that we construct and deploy to build things, to build vocabularies, to build concepts, to build institutions, to build lives, to build political structures and processes. And so we must think of language as an invention, and like all inventions, think of it as a tool. And this will be a critical element in the book. It's a very powerful idea Rorty develops. And we're going to talk about this when we get to the preface, and this will be a part of the discussion for Tuesday. So we must come to conceive completely language as a human invention, as a kind of assertion of power, as a tool that enables us to do things. Tools empower us to build other things, to do things, to create things that don't exist in nature, that don't exist in the world. So languages are tools. Tools are forms of power. They empower us. What do they empower us to do? To build things, important things. And we must also, again, and riffing off Nietzsche, but also critical to all postmodern thought. It's not just that words are tools and that we use tools to build things and to do things, but the tools are always changing. They're contingent. Language is contingent. Because language is a human invention as a tool, and because we invent these tools to do things, to empower us, as history, as the genealogy of morals unfolds, as the history of human life unfolds, we are faced with new necessities, new challenges. New tools are always emerging. New words as tools are always emerging that help us do new things, or to do old things in new ways, or to meet challenges, conceptual, material challenges that show up as life unfolds. So language is contingent. And so he's very Nietzschean in this way. He's very postmodernism. Language is an invention. It's a tool. Tools empower us to build. What do we build? We build reality. But things are always changing. The words are changing. The meanings are changing. The values are changing. History is changing. So it's contingent. So one of the most beautiful and intoxicating things about human life, Rorty will argue, and he's riffing this from Nietzsche, is our ability to be creative as the linguistic tool makers. And so Rorty is deeply postmodern in this way. And as a postmodernist, for Rorty, like it was for Nietzsche, language does not serve as the truth. That serves as a guide to human activity or the mechanism by which we measure its moral validity. And like Nietzsche, for Rorty, the purpose of freedom, the purpose of language and the purpose of freedom are to enable us, to empower us to become as self-creative about one's meaning, one's value, and one's purposes as humanly possible. Again, for Nietzsche and for Rorty, the project is a kind of art of life, consciousness as a project of artistic self-creation, one's life, one's embodiment as a project of artistic self-creation. And Rorty will call this project becoming a strong poet. And we'll see that in chapter 2. For Rorty, like Nietzsche, life is an aesthetic experience. It's an experience of art, not a moral project. However, as we will see, Rorty is extremely suspicious of the need for and the consequences of Nietzsche's very severe aristocratic elitism. Rorty is concerned. He doesn't necessarily agree with it, and two, he's concerned about the consequences of it. So while Rorty is very Nietzschean, extraordinarily Nietzschean in certain important ways, Rorty rejects Nietzsche's severe anti-political, anti-social elitism. The kind of severe, kind of elitist, aristocratic critique of the slave morality, and especially the way Nietzsche's critique of the slave morality gets assigned to a Nietzschean critique of, as we said earlier, modern liberal egalitarian democracy. Rorty does not validate, he does not follow Nietzsche down that path. He finds Nietzsche's severe social, political criticism to be unnecessary. And not only does he find it to be unnecessary, but he finds it dangerous. So Rorty is deeply committed to a Nietzschean product, the Nietzschean project of viewing language in a certain way and viewing freedom and the acts of freedom and the directions they are sort of set into motion in terms of the purpose of self-creation. He's deeply Nietzschean. He's erotically Nietzschean in that regard. Life is a poetic project. It's an artistic project. But he does not share, nor does he advocate Nietzsche's severe anti-social and anti-democratic tendencies. He is very suspicious. Rorty is very suspicious of the need for and the consequence of Nietzsche's severe aristocratic and anti-political purposes. For Rorty, there is something deeply destructive and ultimately impossible in Nietzsche's stance towards the slave morality and in his stance and his criticism towards liberal democracy. And this takes us to Mill. How does Rorty radicalize the negative freedom of J.S. Mill? Rorty is suspicious of Nietzsche's creative and political elitism for two reasons. First, Rorty sees himself as a good liberal. Rorty recognizes our historical time and space. He recognizes the dominant discourse of our contemporary time and space. These legal and political institutions and processes associated with liberal philosophy that produce certain types of social and political spaces that maximize human freedom, that allow for as comprehensive a space as possible in the social space and the political space for human freedom, for the cultivation of private desires and the pursuit of private fulfillment. Rorty is a postmodernist, and he looks around and he says, our cultural moment, this broader social space, our cultural moment is liberal democracy. And liberal democracy produces these ideas about the importance of freedom and about the importance of respect for others and about the importance of private lives and the need to cultivate what he'll call private fantasies and idiosyncrasies. Our culture recognizes the importance of those things. And Rorty says, even if our cultural story is itself a human invention, which he does. He willingly acknowledges the idea that liberal democracy, as a set of ideas and norms and practices and institutions and processes, that liberal democracy is a cultural invention. It's a human invention. It's a poem. But as far as human inventions go, as far as human constructions go, Rorty wants to argue, some of the ideas associated with liberal democracy, personal freedom, the pursuit of private interests, the creation of private ideas about beauty and about the purpose of life and the meaning of life, the need to create social and political spaces animated by a great diversity of ideas about those things. Rorty's going to argue that there's something valuable about that there's something extraordinarily powerful and valuable about that. There is something extremely valuable and powerful about the image of a kind of enlightened social and political democracy that Mill had in mind. Rorty thinks there's something extremely interesting about that, valuable about that. Even though the ideas that animate that description of that space, even though those ideas are human inventions or cultural values, that's all true, they are nonetheless interesting and valuable, and they're worth celebrating and they're worth maintaining. So Rorty is a Nietzschean who is also a good liberal. He identifies himself in many ways as a person who finds it good and good because it facilitates other things, not good because it coheres with some metaphysical definition, but good because the idea of personal freedom and the way one uses personal freedom to pursue private and idiosyncratic and creative lives and expressions of lives and dreams and desires, that's a beautiful thing. To create a social space that is populated with as many different kinds of people, with as many claims to the good and to the interesting and the creative, to create a social space with as many people like that, that's a beautiful thing, Rorty says. And to find a way to politicize that into something like a postmodern pluralism, a postmodern democracy, Rorty says that's something valuable. And that those are ideas that we can defend. So Rorty, in some ways, sees himself as a good liberal, while Rorty fully acknowledges that our liberal ideas and values are contingent, hence the title, contingency. Contingency. Rorty fully acknowledges that our highest values are human inventions. Our highest values of liberal freedom and respect for others, and a plurality of goods and a plurality of ways of seeing things and living and doing, all those things that Mill in some ways very intensely advocated for and defended. Rorty supports Mill in the sort of celebration of those things. Of course, he doesn't see him as objectively true as Mill did, but he still finds the ability to sort of celebrate him. While Rorty fully acknowledges that our liberal values and ideas are contingent, they are nonetheless ours. And in the big scheme of things, they are good. They serve beneficial, pragmatic goods. And he still thinks they're good and they ought to be protected and defended. And second, Rorty has a more nuanced view than Nietzsche about our place and our situatedness within the social and political arena. For Rorty, and this is a kind of a gaze that is more common with the thinkers like Foucault and Rorty and Derrida and Butler, the more contemporary postmodern thinkers. For Rorty, unlike Nietzsche, there are no real effective modes of escape from the contingently constructed social and political sphere. And this is a bit nuanced. So we're talking about nuances. We're not talking about category differences. We're talking about nuances here. And we're talking about a nuanced difference between someone like Nietzsche and Rorty, or someone like Nietzsche and Foucault. And that this nuance, it refers to the kind of the awareness of our situatedness in the social and political space. And you think, okay, what the hell am I talking about? when you read Nietzsche, it's clearly the case that Nietzsche understands subjectivity as constructed, as something that is constructed through power, through language, of course. Right? That's the whole point of these differences in conceptions, right? This knightly aristocratic conception of things produces a certain type of person. Slave morality, metaphysics produces a certain type of person. So Nietzsche fully acknowledges the constructedness of selves, that there is no objectively true self, as we saw in Nietzsche's critique of Mill. As we see in Rorty, there's no objectively true self. There are real people having real conversations who show up in the social and political space with various meanings and possibilities, but none of that is objectively true. So Nietzsche understands that, and in many ways Nietzsche celebrates it. And then in this agonistic, in this kind of warrior, knightly aristocratic, agonistic spirit, as we saw in the genealogy of morals, right? The purpose of freedom is to, one, become aware of the constructed nature of self, especially if the constructed nature of self is causing harm in you. If what's been constructed in you is a slave morality, it's harming you, and you need to become aware of that. And then you need to begin the process of disentangling yourself from those ideas that are causing you self-hatred, and causing you resentment, and causing you to become nihilistic. And for Nietzsche, there's something very martial about that. There's something very warrior-like about that, right? And not only is there something quite agonistic about that, and kind of heroically combative, and in some ways it's quite beautiful, but also Nietzsche tends to believe that the ability for one to separate oneself from the others, from the many, from the herd, right? The ability for one to create critical distance and critical space from the herd, from the masses, from the legions of the slave morality. Nietzsche wants to emphasize the greater possibility of doing that. As you will recall in the first essay of the genealogy of morals, one of the primary distinguishing characteristics of this knightly aristocratic, this original notion of good emerging from people who created the meaning and had the strength to assert it. One of the original characteristics of that dynamic was precisely how, in seizing the right to coin and name and define value, and having the strength to assert it as a will to power and to open up the space of reality, how in doing that, these original aristocratic and knightly figures created what Nietzsche calls the pathos of distance. There's that extraordinarily powerful phrase, the pathos of distance, right? That people who have the ability, right, to conceive in a creative, poetic way one's meaning, one's value, and to assert it, and to carve out, either to open up dominant spaces of meaning in the social and political space, or to carve out their own, as he called it in the preface, his own secret garden. Nietzsche valorized the sort of capacity to do that, one, and then he celebrated it in and through what he called the pathos of distance. The pathos of distance. In Nietzsche's kind of heroic / severe elitism, The purpose of disentangling yourself from the herd is not just to free yourself of resentment, but to create an open distance, to create and open a pathos of distance between the community, between the masses, between the sheep, between the herd. And Nietzsche's obsessed with this pathos of distance. And ultimately, in Nietzsche's valorization of this, there's little room for compatibility between the slave morality of the masses and these heroic, intellectual, creative people. And again, that's one of the reasons why he's critical of politics. That's one of the reasons why Nietzsche, in some ways, isn't compatible with democratic politics. How do you negotiate living in the slave morality among the herd in mass consumer society? How does one tolerate that and still create this pathos of distance? And if you created this pathos of distance, where do you go? And so Rorty is looking at this obsession with the pathos of distance from a certain point of view. And he's going to nuance it. To be sure, Rorty will have his own version of this pathos of distance. It will be called creating your own private life, becoming a strong poet. But for Rorty, this pathos of distance does not have to result in a destruction of the democratic and liberal political order. Rorty has to find a way of making Nietzsche compatible with liberal politics. How do we conceive of engaging in Nietzsche's project in creative beauty while at the same time remaining situated, a part of, within, living amongst other people, and especially other people in a liberal social and political space? That's the challenge. So Rorty accepts and celebrates some of the more interesting and useful and emancipating elements of Mill's account of liberal freedom and democracy. Rorty thinks that there are ways of making Nietzsche's strong poet compatible with liberal democracy. And for Rorty, liberal culture not only advocates expansive notions of freedom, but also ever-expanding notions of diversity of forms and modes of expression and lifestyle. That ultimately, from Rorty's kind of creative and aesthetic point of view, are necessary for the continuing cultivation of lives and cultures as works of art. So Rorty wants to imagine, and he wants to articulate, and he wants to show us how to do it, to create a postmodern democracy. How do we radicalize Mill and make Nietzsche amenable to liberal democratic politics? And that's the project, in contingency, irony, and solidarity. And that's the way we're going to end this class on freedom and this investigation of freedom through the great debate in contemporary political theory, modern, postmodern philosophy, by trying to imagine the creation of a postmodern liberal democracy. All right, any questions?
Professor?
Yep, go ahead, Ruth.
So is there so it's saying pretty much like Rorty is more grounded in some way, that he didn't feel the necessity to escape, to find that there has to be a place where you can escape, like the Dionysian for Nietzsche, and rather he sees it that you should be more grounded, more practical, deal with what's here.
Yeah, so Jennifer, I love the term practical. Okay, and I was waiting to bring this up when we got into chapter 1, chapter 2, or when we got into some of the more difficult questions about what Rorty's trying to do. Because Rorty's trying to do something that is, again, it's rather nuanced, and he has actually been the object of great criticism for it. Okay, but your question gets right to what he's trying to do. So Rorty, if you read Rorty, if you ever go to graduate school, or you know, well, now that it's quarantine, you've got lots of time. If you read other things from Rorty, and this emerges out of this extraordinarily vicious debate in academia between modernity and postmodernity. Like this debate gets pretty ugly in the deep sort of thematics of it. And the debates are quite hostile and aggressive. And Rorty was trying to negotiate his way through those debates. And one of the ways he negotiated his way through some of the more difficult elements of the debate between metaphysics and postmodernism was to describe himself as a pragmatist. Rorty would have, I for the purposes of this class, I identify as a postmodern in a kind of a Nietzschean theme, and that's okay for this class and for the story we're telling. But if you were to ask Nietzsche, Rorty, how he would describe himself, he probably wouldn't describe himself as a postmodern. And he certainly would not have described himself as a relativist, which is how all people who are committed to some sort of metaphysics characterize people who are postmodern. Okay? If you are an advocate of some sort of metaphysical theory and you are in a hot debate with people who are suspicious of your idea of the truth, one of the nasty tools you deploy to hurt them is to call them, him or her, a relativist, right? And again, I don't want to get in the woods about that. We could have a whole lecture on that. But the people who are committed to a postmodern point, a metaphysical point of view, that there's some truth out there with a moral orientation, they use the term relativist as a critique, because they say, well, if you're not committed to some notion of objective truth, some philosophical truth, some theological truth, or some scientific truth, you hear this in Jordan Peterson. Apparently he's hot in the YouTube zone, and he's a critic of postmodernism, and he criticizes postmodernists as being relativists. And what it means is that for relativists are relativists, right? They're anti-metaphysical. They're relativists, and to be a relativist means that you say all goods, all values are the same, right? Well, there's no truth. No one can know the truth. So therefore, there is no truth. There are no moral standards, and therefore all moral standards are equally valuable, right? And so if cannibalism is your moral standard, well, okay, right? Or child circumcision or female circumcision. If those are your values, well, they're just your values, and there's nothing anybody can say about them. So people who are advocates of metaphysics often accuse people like Nietzsche or Rorty as being relativists, right? And then therefore say, well, according to your view, Rorty, or according to your view, Foucault, or according to your view, Derrida or Judith Butler, values, morals, are cultural products, And because we have no way of measuring the high, sort of a qualitative value between the moral values, then they're all equally valid. And so you're a relativist, everything is equally good. You can't defend mass murder. You can't defend all these things. Right? That's the sort of boot camp people who are advocates of metaphysics level against people like Rorty. And in an attempt to evade that, right, Rorty said, I'm not a relativist, I'm a pragmatist. And what he meant by that, and we're going to see it in the book, and Rorty was getting to something extremely important in this bigger debate about what postmodernism is, right? And he's right, and Rorty was right. People who accuse postmodernists of being relativists are really uninformed at the end of the day. They're not informed. And Rorty's trying to sort of respond to these people being uninformed. And Rorty says, I'm not a relativist. Rorty says, I am not standing up here and saying all cultural values are equally good. He says, I'm not. First of all, he says, to say something like that is stupid. It's meaningless, right? Because as a member of any culture, people tend to believe that their cultural values are good. That's the first thing. There really aren't relativists out there in the world. There aren't actually people out in the world having lives and building cultures and building political institutions that say all values are equally good, and if you want to slaughter people or you want to engage in female mutilation or you want to engage in cannibalism, well, that's just what you do. First of all, it's a misnomer. And two, Rorty says, I'm not a relativist. I'm not, in fact, he calls himself a good liberal. And as we'll see in the book, he will say, I am prepared. I am prepared to defend values like freedom, like privacy, like the creation of a social space populated by lots of views and claims about what things are. He says, way of viewing life and viewing the political space. And I think that's valuable. Those are our values, and those are valuable values. And he'll even say, I prefer, as a pragmatist, as a postmodern kind of pragmatist, I prefer those values over totalitarian regimes. And I will advocate for it, and I will argue for it. But he says, in defending liberal values, because they facilitate certain things that from a certain point of view in our time and space, we want to celebrate and advocate, right? In defending those things, I'm never going to be able to give you some mathematical formula about why you should do it. The best that I will be able to do, and this is a very powerful part of end of the preface and the first chapter. He says the best people can ever really do when they have these big debates is try to make the position they're advocating for look as, and this sounds so silly, but it's so deeply true, to make the position they're advocating for look as interesting to other people as humanly possible. Right? And Rorty says, and by the way, this is part of the bigger project for Rorty of abandoning the whole language, what he will call vocabulary of metaphysics. The whole language of metaphysics, the whole vocabulary of metaphysics, one, it doesn't allow you to do what you want to do. You want to find the truth. You want to prove the truth, but language won't let you do that. And two, trying to have debates in the context of metaphysical language always fails, right? And you see this everywhere. You even just in the debate between Catholics and Protestants, right? Or between different religions, right? There's no way in language, especially metaphysical conceptions of language, there's never any possibility of one party in the debate being able to, whatever proof would mean in this regard, to conclusively prove, here's some metrics, here's some linguistic or mathematical, right? Here's some algorithm that is going to allow me to conclusively prove in and through this language the hierarchy of my moral values over yours. It's not possible, Rorty's going to argue. It's not possible. And so that's why the vocabulary of metaphysics, when it engages in these debates about the objective truth, and more viciously in who possesses it, always end up in a kind of stalemate. And every debate about objective truth that you'll ever have with anybody who believes in an objective truth and is trying to convince you of an objective truth, and whenever you see a debate between two people arguing like this, it always, first of all, it's never resolved. And two, it always ends in the same way. Well, it's just what I believe. I can't prove it to you. It's just what I believe. The Catholic says this is just what I believe about the Mass, and the Protestant says, nope, you're wrong. And that's how it ends. Right? And Rorty is going to say, look, one, we understand why it ends that way. The one, you're positing an objective truth that's out there, it's probably not out there. And two, the idea that you're going to get there through a language that is a human invention is impossible. And so Rorty says, so this great debate, so in a really deep way, and we're going to get to this later, in a really deep way, Rorty would really like us. And I know this sounds insane, but there's something poetic and empowering about it. He says, ultimately, we should just stop talking about objective truth, period. We should sort of articulate, he'll call it a vocabulary. We should create words as tools and create a vocabulary as a toolbox that no longer has words for things like objective truth. We need a new vocabulary. And in the big scheme of things, in the big debate, and this is why he calls himself a pragmatist. He says, I'm a liberal. He says, I'm randomly, accidentally thrown into some cultural time and space. Could have been anywhere, but for me, it was post-World War II America, with its liberal values and its claims to human freedom and private autonomy and respect for others and the equality of life and the need for lots of ideas and pluralistic ideas in the social space. That's my cave. Now, it just so happens that some of these, not all of them, some of these values are good from a certain pragmatic sort of way, right? And we should celebrate them, and we should cultivate some, but not because we can prove them objectively superior to something like what North Korea does. No one can ever do that. But because from a certain point of view, they facilitate certain things that we want to celebrate. So Rorty says, I'm a pragmatist. I'm going to defend these certain values. I'm going to always be trying to improve them, and I'm going to defend them, but I can't prove them to you. And ultimately, the best I can do, Rorty would say in a debate, is try to convince you, to try to make these values look as interesting to you as possible. So you would say to yourself, hey, what an interesting way to think. Right? What an interesting way. I would like to try that. And for Rorty, as crazy as it sounds, this is it. For Rorty, historically, the great philosophical debates in history, they're not proven because Wittgenstein figured it out or Kant figured it out. Vocabularies, discourses in Foucault's language change. So Rorty's a pragmatist. He's practical, right? And this is what he dismisses in Nietzsche, where he says, hey, I'm from New York City. I'm an intellectual. I went to Princeton, got a degree in political philosophy, right? And I'm living in this cool city. There's all this great stuff going on. There's all these smart people going on. And I'm pretty free to spend my life doing what I find interesting, and no one's oppressing me. And boy, we should have more of that. That's a pragmatism, he says, right? And so he's kind of suspicious about Nietzsche's criticism of the slave morality, criticism of liberal democracy, right? One, Rorty says you don't need it in a way, and two, it's destructive. All right, Ruth, real quick, and then we'll call it a day.
I was wondering if I could actually email you so that I could get clear clarification, because it's just like a summary of everything, but I think it might take too long.
Well, come to office hours. Don't email me.
Okay, then. Got it.
Yep. Because these can get very long.
Okay, I'll write it down and then go to office hours.
Good. All right, everybody. Everybody good?
Good.
See you Tuesday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The introduction to
Thank you.
Rorty. Everybody understand the arc of the class?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi, Professor. I'll see
Have a
you.
good day.
Bye.
Bye,
Thanks,
everybody.
Professor. Bye.